For those of you that watch my channel, you might know that I used to live in Japan, and when I was there, I made a video where I went shopping at Bookoff, Japan's best kept secret for second-hand watch shopping. You might have also noticed that I didn't post a video 2 weeks ago when I normally would have, if you're subscribed and get notifications. Which you are, right? Right? Well, the reason I didn't post a video is because during that time I was back in Japan to visit. And what else would I do while I was there but go back to the scene of the crime and check out how the stock of watches had changed? Without further ado, let's take a look at what I saw. Because I got asked this a lot in the comments in my previous shopping video, this store is called Bookoff, and this particular location is in Sakae, Nagoya. Bookoff is a chain of second-hand stores that buy and sell pretty much everything, but I was here to look at the watches. This first cabinet starts off with quite a few tagged Quartz watches before moving into some Omega Speedmasters, a dress watch, and an old Seamaster. Below those is quite a decent range of both more recent and older Longines watches, as well as 2 more Omegas that didn't make the cut for the shelf above. Generally, the watches are organised by brand in these cabinets. Moving even further down, there is this very nice looking Aquaterra with a grey dial, and a Constellation that, judging by the plastic, is still in new condition. Another Speedmaster and a ladies' watch round off this cabinet, but this is only the beginning. In this next cabinet, we have some of their higher end Seiko watches, including this King Seiko. This one is the limited edition that features a textured dial meant to replicate a turtle shell. Next to that is a very interesting perpetual calendar Quartz Alpinist. I've seen these becoming more popular lately and selling for quite a lot, just like this one is. Next to it is a fairly chunky but straightforward Astron watch. On the next row is a Willard by the looks of it, though I'm far from an expert on this line of Seiko watches. And next to that is a 62 mass style Shohei Ohtani limited edition. I wonder if the value of these have gone up or down since that deal he signed. Even further down, and we can see an out of focus Marine Master tuner with a striking yellow bezel, a turtle collaboration with a brand I'm not very familiar with, and another turtle. The case below starts off with some wired watches, which is an ultra budget sub-brand of Seiko offered in Japan. Then the fun begins with a whole lot of radio wave solar Seikos. I really like these Brights watches from Seiko and have owned more than a few, even though the radio wave function doesn't actually work in Australia. On the next row, we have a variety of different Seiko models, including that gold tone Grand Quartz, which was cool to see amongst the others. That blue dialed Sarks also caught my eye as I went past. When we get back in focus, we can see some more vintage Seikos, including a Bellmatic. Moving on, and we can see more than enough Seiko 5s for you to find one you like. Including a Pepsi Sea Urchin that was 10% off. From 5s to divers, there were quite a few vintage Quartz divers here, followed by some regular Quartz. And the bottom row rounds us off with this cabinet. Okay, now we're getting to the serious business. Right off the bat, there are some Grand Seikos, both pre and post split, as well as Seiko's third diver, all keeping the cult classic SKX company. New and old down here, but mostly old with some vintage divers. The less common SKX 023 with the crown at 3, as well as 2 older Gen Sumos were also available here. A newer speed timer was also mixed in there with the divers. I've been pretty interested in some of the older Quartz divers from Seiko recently, so it was good to see so many here in the flesh. This row down here has some more modern models, including that Sumo, King Turtle, and Arnie. This cabinet definitely focused heavily on Seiko divers. Underneath all of that, and we move on to some other brands, starting off with Orient, and back there are some Orient Stars, their higher end line, and one of the newer Kamasu models in burgundy. And just like that, we're back to Seiko again, with these mostly ladies' watches, as well as some from their Dolce line. Those watches are always very dressy and often extremely thin. Hiding in the corner on the row below is this 1 of 300 watch that was a collaboration with Nano Universe, and caused quite a stir when it was released, due to its resemblance to an old Rolex. Moving further along, you can have your pick of old or new Seikos, including a Seiko 5 field watch. On this row below, drifting in and out of focus, we have some watches from another budget Seiko brand, Alba, as well as some ladies Seiko watches too. Finally, on the bottom row of this cabinet, there was a selection of ladies watches from Seiko's Lucia range. They just keep coming, and now it's Citizen's turn in the spotlight. We start off with this vintage bullhead before moving on to a stunning Chronomaster. This range as a whole has started to gain some well-deserved popularity in recent times. The final watch on this shelf is a Citizen Campanola, which is another of their very high-end lines. When it comes to Citizen, you have to expect some eco drive, and there were plenty of them here in these Atessa watches. Also, here are some of Citizen's radio wave watches that work very similarly to Seiko's. I'm not as passionate about Citizen as much as I am Seiko, so there wasn't too much that stood out to me here, but that white dial auto was very nice. More Quartz Eco Drive watches on the row below this, including that very green ProMaster diver. That one back there, I believe, is one of their insanely high accuracy quartz watches. It was also ultra thin, which you can't exactly see from this angle. Down in the case below, we start off with some women's watches, but then move on to the next big Japanese brand, Casio. Here, there are some Edifice watches as well as this Oceanus that everyone should more or less know by now. A cool little diver before we move into a few digital watches and a few from Casio's Lineage range. A lot of these ones are Casio Wave Scepter watches, which is just another word for the same radio wave technology we saw in both Citizen and Seiko watches earlier. The bottom row has just a couple of Baby G watches, as a teaser for what's to come. And that of course is G-Shock, and lots of them. There's a Frogman here which I know very little about, as well as quite a few collaboration and anniversary edition watches. There are way too many for me to keep up with, but I'm sure a die-hard G-Shock fan would be in heaven here. I'm not a fan of all the designs, but I do think you can't go wrong with the classic 5600 shape, and its many various forms. Moving further down, and we get into some of the more normal G-Shock models. I did appreciate the fact that they had gotten all of the yellow ones together to make this row. There are quite a few squares here, but further on we can see some of the more out there designs from Casio. It's only right to see the Casio here too, after all the hype around that model over the last few years. But we're not done with G-Shock. There was another full cabinet of them. There is only so much I can say about G-Shocks, so I'll just let you watch in some peace and quiet for a minute. And of course, the cabinet below had more. This time though, they were new rather than second-hand watches, in case you wanted to spend that little bit extra to get a fresh one. I think with G-Shocks though, they're indestructible enough that there's not really anything to worry about when getting one second-hand, other than maybe cleaning off the underside of the case and strap to remove any grime or dirt. All in all, a lot of G-Shocks. Moving on to the next section, and this is more or less the miscellaneous or the smaller groups of brands that didn't have enough to deserve their own section. Here you can sometimes find some hidden gems, or in this case, an AliExpress special, with that Sharky Monster homage. The price they're asking is a bit ambitious though. Further along, there are some interesting designs, but this Mondaine was pretty cool. If you look closely, there's actually a Gerard Perregaux women's watch hiding in there. I've seen quite a few not brand watches over the years at Bookoff. They're apparently a Japanese micro brand that seem to have a mix of very generic designs and some pretty special ones, using supposedly the same supplier to Grand Seiko for cases. Along the row underneath, there are some more random watches. The cabinet underneath is more of the same, even if some of it is out of focus. Another brand you see often in Japan is Ricoh, and there's one here. The next row again has mostly women's watches, but nothing that stood out to me in particular. Next we can see a Daytona homage, followed by some more out of focus women's watches. On the row underneath, there is an interesting burgundy coloured Seiko. I think it's one of their speaking watches, but I'm not too sure. If you know, post a comment below. And we round off the cabinet with the last row and some more fashion and women's watches. Up next, and we're back to some sorting by brands. Some Sector, a single Victorinox, followed by a few Luminox. In the other video I made, there were quite a lot of them back then too. I wonder if these are the same ones. Underneath that is a whole row of Suunto watches. I can't say I've ever been too interested in these, but if you want one, you can get one here. More on the next row, but hiding in there is a bull of a Devil Diver. It gets the name from that 666 feet water resistance rating. It was nice to see. Moving further along, and there are quite a few Waltham watches. It's a brand you see surprisingly often in Japan, and you can see they had quite a few here. The case underneath starts off with mostly fashion watches. Until we get to the second row here, which has a few Timex watches. I thought that one with the California dial was pretty cool. The case size is quite small, but I don't know if I could pull it off. After Timex, we start again where we left off, with a whole lot of fashion watches. The next row has quite a few Wengo watches. Maybe it's the name, but I've never really been that interested in getting one. On the bottom row here is another brand you don't get many opportunities to see in the flesh too often, HMT. There is even an out of focus Mickey Mouse one. By this point, we're well into fashion watch territory, so I'm speeding through these. There are watches by Hermes, Gucci, Christian Dior, and even more Gucci. Most of that cabinet was Gucci actually. Underneath is more of the same, with a variety of other fashion brands. Nothing particularly interesting to me down here. After all of the fashion watches, this next case was a breath of fresh air with a nice selection of Hamiltons. That khaki automatic with the brown dial in particular was very nice. You can find quite a lot of very well priced second-hand Hamiltons in Japan, and Bookoff especially. Dunhill is another one of those brands you wouldn't necessarily expect to see, but do see quite a lot in Japan. Enough to make a second row of them here. A couple of Frederique Constants end the row there. Perhaps not some of their best designs, but still good to see the brand represented. Fashion watches round off this cabinet. The case below was pretty much exclusively Cartier, and almost exclusively women's watches, though I guess the smaller tanks could be unisex. We're on the home stretch here, and start off with some heavier hitters like this Maurice Lacroix. Before moving into the Tissot section, where there is a singular PRX hiding away. More fashion watches here, and a single Oris to finish off the top cabinet. The case below again is pretty much all women's watches. The last stop at this Bookoff was this new case that wasn't there the last time I visited. That was over a year ago though, so they've had time to add it. This case had mostly vintage Japanese brands such as Seiko, Casio and Citizen. There were some pretty cool pieces in here, and you can definitely see a lot of the Japanese design language that Seiko and Citizen shared during the time period when these were made. On this second shelf underneath, there are more interesting pieces, including an old Seiko Monster, and up the back there a King Seiko for a pretty good price. If you're willing to add your own strap to these at the front, you can also save a bit extra on your watch purchase. This bottom shelf had a few Swiss pieces creeping in, including that square Omega down the front, and some Longines and Rado up the back on the other side. For those interested in pocket watches, there were also a couple down the front. Okay, I lied. This is the last stop. If you've really got some cash to splash at Bookoff, you can get yourself a Rolex or two from this cabinet, where they keep the special watches. Aside from the rollies, there were some Tudors, including an original Ranger, and my pick, this Black Bay 36. Next to those are a couple of Omega watches, a Constellation, and a Seamaster. But up here is what really got my attention, a Vacheron 56, the watch that I would probably pick if I could only have one watch and no budget, even though it's technically the cheapest watch the brand offers. And now we come back to the present and I'm back in Sydney. So, did I buy anything? Of course I did, but the question is what? Well, I bought 3, and 2 of them are actually G-Shocks. The first is the black Casio. For 6,000 yen, which is currently converting to about $40 US, I had to grab it at that price. I was neither here nor there on the Casio before getting this one, but as I've worn it, it has really grown on me. This model is the thinnest G-Shock made, and it definitely makes a difference to the wearing experience. I'm also glad it's not the completely blacked out version, which has some legibility issues. The other G-Shock I picked up was this square 5600. I didn't actually notice it on the first time around, but I'm glad I made a second pass. It's a limited edition ANA, All Nippon Airways, the Japanese national airline, branded one that was only available to purchase in flight. There have been some ANA Seiko collaborations, but I had never seen a G-Shock one, so I picked it up. A cool little feature is that the backlight has the silhouette of a plane when you turn it on. The final piece I picked up, and probably the one I was most excited about, is this. A Seiko Lordmatic with a linen dial. I've been looking for a linen dial for quite a while now, and this is pretty much the exact one I was looking for on the bracelet. It's a very classy, vintage size, and often these watches have some staining on the dial, but thankfully this one doesn't. For a watch that's just over 50 years old, it looks and runs very well, within 10 seconds per day so far. And, to top things off, the bracelet just fits perfectly. Overall, I'm pretty happy with my haul from Bookoff. But, what do you think? Were there other watches you would have bought? Did I make good choices? Should I have gotten more? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.